Welcome, everyone, to Majoring in the Majors with Pastor S.J. Munson on the Artist First Radio Network. All past shows are podcasts. You can find them at artistfirst.com. Your host is the author of two books, The Treasure of Israel and Christ Held Hostage, the Hijacking of American Christianity. Ladies and gentlemen, it's Pastor S.J. Munson.
Hi, this is S.J. Munson, and welcome to Majoring in the Majors. In today's politically divided church, we often hear pastors preaching unity and mutual acceptance and affirmation, as if harmony within the church is the most important thing, more important even than truth and faithfulness to the demands of the gospel, including speaking on behalf of the poor and oppressed. Here to talk about just what that gospel demands of us as Christians is Pastor Jonny Rashid, who is a graduate of Temple University and Palmer Theological Seminary, and for over 12 years has served as pastor for Circle of Hope, an Anabaptist cell church in Philadelphia. He is the son of parents who emigrated from Egypt. He's an abolitionist and a housing activist, and he is an active blogger and hosts the popular Circle of Hope, Resist and Restore podcast. He's the author of a new book entitled JesusTakes Aside, Embracing the Political Demands of the Gospel. Jonny Rashid, thank you so much for making the time to be with us.
I'm so happy to be here. Thanks so much for having me, SJ.
So we often hear Christians say that we shouldn't dirty our hands by messing with politics. Politics is a dirty game. Christians should not be involved, should not take sides in partisan struggles, but should instead seek a so-called third way that affirms both sides. How do you answer that?
Well, I think it's a nice idea to keep our hands clean and not get involved in politics because it's messy, but I think when we do that, we burden the most vulnerable and the marginalized the most. There are political implications and demands to the gospel that ask us to take a side and to be clear with our allegiance to Jesus, who is Lord, as well as the most vulnerable. And so for us to be faithful disciples, we must side with, as Matthew in chapter 25 calls them, and Jesus is saying this, the least of these brothers and sisters. So from my viewpoint, it's essential that we take a side with the marginalized. And if that means getting political, then that is what it means to follow Jesus.
Now, you say in your book, and I'm not quoting you word for word here, but that the cross of Christ is effectively not just pie in the sky when you die, but it has undeniable political connotations. And here I quote, "It saves captives, it frees the oppressed, it rights all wrongs, it reconciles the world to God. Jesus' dying on the cross is a political event, and the love of Christ it demonstrates compels us to be political too." Can you unpack that for us?
Sure. I'll start with a story. It's January 2017. It was right after Donald Trump's inauguration. And one of the first things the administration did was it was an executive action called the Muslim ban. It was popularly known as the Muslim ban. And that meant that from a series of nations, no one could come into the United States. And this occurred, and then people who were coming from those nations were locked behind airport gates and couldn't get through. This event was happening while I was helping to lead worship at what we call our Love Feast. It's an Anabaptist communion meal that happens quarterly at our church. And my job was to administer communion, to offer the words of institution to the congregation who was gathered there. And I was getting updates that people were locked at PHL, Philadelphia's airport, which is where we're from, and O'Hare and all over the country. And my heart was breaking at this moment that people that looked like me, an Arab American, people that looked like my children, were being locked up. And I could not offer communion without mentioning this event and that I need Jesus to save these literal captives. It would be disingenuous for me to offer communion without naming that this cross that frees us, that saves us, must also save these people as well. That if it doesn't, then why do we even believe in the resurrection of Jesus, the physical, material resurrection of Jesus? The cross has to have political, material implications. It needs to change the world right from the start. And so to me, when Jesus wages war against death, we have to look everywhere in our society about where death is and participate in bringing life there. And when we look at death, we see direct connections to political issues. When we see police brutality that results in the death of black men disproportionately, that's something that the cross is trying to undo. Same with keeping immigrants out of the country or sending them back to where they came from, or worse, keeping them in cages on our border. These are issues that the cross speaks to if we affirm that the cross indeed defeats death, and that's the work of Jesus.
You talk in your book about bipartisanship, which has sort of been a hallmark of our political system when it's working. In order to work, it has to be bipartisan. But you say in your book that really bipartisanship can be an acquiescence to the status quo and a vehicle to move society, to not move society at all forward, that we have to get beyond that. Can you talk about that and explain what you mean?
Sure. The most bipartisan bills that pass in our legislators are ones that result in the increase of the salaries of the legislators. Those are the bills that are passed. When we pass bills that everybody agrees on, it is largely the status quo. It is largely about continuing what is happening now. But to make change, we're going to have to appear rather partisan. It isn't that we are incidentally partisan when we do so. So when we look at the civil rights movement, and you look at a character like Martin Luther King, who today has been sanitized into a very popular figure among right and left and among all races and so on. Very high approval ratings for Martin Luther King today. When you look back at his legacy and his time and place, he was not very popular. He was actually very polarizing. And so the idea that the action that we need to do should be something that is bipartisan, be something that reaches across the aisle, really doesn't speak to the needs that we have. So in moments of change, I'm afraid that we're often going to have to do something that's woefully unpopular. And I don't think, and popularity in particular, is what makes things appear bipartisan. I don't think that Jesus did his ministry and organized his mission around what everybody would agree to. And he was not afraid to be polarizing as a result of that. And I think that when we see polarization, we think the antidote to it is bipartisanship, making sure that everybody is at the table. The issue with that is it maintains the status quo, but putting everybody at the table too fundamentally dilutes our convictions to side with the oppressed. And so when we look at history, specifically the civil rights era and other times of change, we'll see a very divided country. And I don't think we would go back and say that civil rights legislation, civil rights acts were wrong, even though a large percentage of the country disagreed with them. We wouldn't say that Martin Luther King is wrong, even though many people disapproved of him. So that is the point that I'm making about bipartisanship.
So when you're talking about becoming partisan or seeming partisan, what does that involve exactly, specifically?
Well, what should guide our politics is being aligned with the oppressed. That is the prevailing idea. This is what Jesus clearly speaks about this throughout the gospel. The gospel is here to liberate the oppressed. Jesus will literally say that in Luke. Jesus came to, as Mary sings in the Magnificat, to lower hills and to raise valleys. Jesus is coming to free the captives. This is the whole gospel story. It's the whole story of the Bible and of God throughout time. We side with the oppressed, and that is how our politics is informed. Now, that has nothing to do with whether we are Democrats or Republicans. That's the thing I want to make sure people understand. Even though there is a political party, when it comes to siding with the oppressed, that seems to often be where we go and vote and support, that doesn't mean that following the Democratic Party agenda makes us followers of Jesus. On the contrary, we should continue to be suspicious of political parties and their motives, because their motives are not rooted in Christ. It is only incidental when we support their actions, because fundamentally they are serving another master. We only participate as a means to helping this greater mission of siding with the oppressed occur. So we are not siding with Marxists, we're not siding with Democrats, we're not siding with liberals or progressives or whatever. We're siding with Jesus, the side that Jesus takes, and sometimes that incidentally aligns us with other political groups. And I welcome the camaraderie and the collaboration and being a part of the conversation. So that's important. That's good. I don't want to be exceptionalistic about saying there's only one way to do it, and that's this way. But if we have the same ends in mind, we can work together to come to the same conclusions. And we will be accused of being partisan or political, but I reject that accusation, because it is not the Democratic Party that's motivating me to side with the oppressed, but Jesus himself. And furthermore, the Democratic Party in the United States right now has demonstrated in the last several years ineptitude, evil, and some good too, but we cannot align ourselves with a political party and say that the job is done. We have to continue to side with the oppressed.
Mm. Do you feel that you identify yourself as a person of color? You are the offspring of people who immigrated here from North Africa, and how has that background and that identity influenced the way that you read and interpret the gospel?
Well, specifically speaking about my Egyptian heritage, I will say that the gospel being set in the ancient Near East and first century Palestine, as an Egyptian, I've actually had a lot of personal connections. There's even some phrases and cultural habits that seem familiar to me even 2,000 years later because of my heritage. So that's one aside. But my experience of being oppressed because of my skin color and because of my heritage has helped me see Jesus as someone who liberates me. So whenever there are stories of liberation in the Bible, parables of liberating the poor, Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount speaking of the same things, I place myself right there in the one who is being saved by Jesus. I want to be liberated, and I long for that. And so I pray that Jesus can liberate me and people like me. So I'm oppressed, and so I am empty. And so I come to the cross and I come to Jesus longing to be filled up. And as I pursue discipleship, as I follow Jesus, I long to also self-empty of all other earthly power that I have in order that I might be filled up by Jesus and his holy power. Just like God himself demonstrated. Like in Philippians 2, Jesus considering equality with God not even possible, self-emptied so that he could be exalted. We're to follow the same example. And the oppressed come already emptied. They come already debased. They come already humble because of what the world has done to them. And Jesus is there to fill them up. And so my experience in oppression, my pain has, to keep my faith, required me to find Jesus, who is going to liberate me from this pain, and join in his world liberation project.
You start out in your book talking about the Old Testament prophets as sort of kind of setting the stage in the Bible for showing what God is like, that God is a God of justice. Can you talk about or maybe highlight some of the prophets and how they did that?
Abraham Joshua Heschel, who marched with Martin Luther King, wrote a book called The Prophets, and in that book he said that the prophets empathize with the pathos of God. In other words, they feel God's feelings and they share them. And when you look at the prophets, you can see their very clear alliance and siding with the poor. You can see it in Isaiah and Jeremiah and all over the prophets. There's a clear liberatory aspect to what the prophets are saying. There is so much. But I'll give you one that I was just preaching on the other week. And this is from Amos, and it's fit for any time. Amos says this, "Hear this, you who trample on the needy and bring ruin to the poor of the land, saying, when will the new moon be over, that we may sell grain in the Sabbath, so that we may offer wheat for sale? We will make the ephah smaller and the shekel heavier, and practice deceit with false balances, buying the poor for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals, and selling the sweepings of the wheat. The Lord has sworn by the pride of Jacob, surely I will never forget any of their deeds." Right there, Amos is talking about economic exploitation of workers. Amos is a shepherd. He's sensitive to the farm work being exploited. And he's talking about people exploiting the most vulnerable. And that's just one example. And then you see Jesus in John 2 and in Matthew 23 when he clears out the temple, following in that exact same prophetic tradition.
How about the Virgin Mary and the Magnificat, something that we hear very often, but maybe don't really hear it in its original intention?
Yeah, I mean, just listen. When Mary learns that she is the one who will give birth to her Messiah, she bursts out into song and says, "My soul glorifies the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God, my Savior. He's been mindful of the humble state of his servant." She is humble, and many will call her blessed. He has performed mighty deeds with his arms. He has scattered those who are proud, brought down rulers from the thrones, and lifted up the humble. He has filled the hungry with good things, and he has sent the rich away empty. It takes a lot of work to hear a song like that and not see the explicit political connections. It takes more work to depoliticize the Gospels than it does to just see them as manifestly political and calling us to contemporary political action. I think that's clear. I think that's right in Luke 1. It's the beginning of Luke's Gospel. And then if you go on, if I may go on, you'll see, once again, glory to God in the highest heaven, or what the angels are singing, and on earth peace to those on whom his favor rests. So Jesus is bringing peace to the world. And then he will, as John the Baptist prepares the way for the Lord in chapter 3, make paths straight for him. Every valley shall be filled in. Every mountain and hill shall be made low. The crooked road shall become straight. The rough ways smooth. And so we will be elevated if we're oppressed, and we'll be lowered if we are powerful. And our roads will be made straight, and our paths made smooth. Which a friend recently told me that could be a pointing to people who need straight roads and smooth paths. He was talking about people on wheelchairs. And I wonder if the prophet was thinking of them too. So making a more equitable society. And then finally in chapter 4, Jesus channels the prophet Isaiah and says, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim the good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of the sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free." Jesus is coming to do those things, to set the oppressed free, coming to give good news to the poor. The gospel is good news to the oppressed and good news to the poor. And if the oppressors would open their ears, they would understand that it isn't a threat to who they are, but it actually humanizes them too, moving them from oppressor to one with God.
Let's talk more about the ministry of Jesus and his relationship with the poor, and his, we can say, activism, his calling Christians to, turn society effectively right side up, because it's upside down. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, I think Jesus is coming to. Just the image of the cross shows us that there's a whole other way of doing things. So, the last shall be first, the first shall be last. And so when we look at our social status, we see who's at the top, who's the most powerful. Well, they'll be brought down, and the oppressed will be brought up. That is how the gospel works. when Jesus is offering this parable of the great banquet. People that are too busy with their jobs, too busy with their livestock, their land, their marriage, they don't want to come to the table because they're too filled already. So who comes to the table? The most lowly, the people with availability. And in our society, those are the oppressed. Those are the least of these. Those are the little ones. And so Jesus invites the lowly to the table and elevates them in their stature. That's how he flips the world upside down. And more than that, he dies to defeat death. He dies in such a way that is so much different than how we're accustomed to people collecting power and making change. So Jesus in the Gospels is consistently demonstrating another way of operating in the world. And that new way informs our politics too. So we look to elevate the oppressed just like Jesus did.
You also talk about, I think it's in chapter 4, you talk about how so often Christians just get hung up with appearances. We're just concerned with how things look, how we appear, how we sound, that's as if that's the most important thing. People don't want to appear political.
Right.
And so could you talk more about that?
Yeah, so when it comes to issues surrounding liberation of immigrants, liberation of people of color, and so on, Christians might talk a big game, but when it sounds like they are political, they'll back off, because in our society, it is impolite to sound political, to appear political. And so I argue that it is vanity that informs this, not the gospel. If we're trying to keep all of our friends, if we're trying to gain the whole world, we'll forfeit our souls. And I don't think that making sure that we don't ruffle any feathers, pastors making sure that they don't isolate the red MAGA hats in their congregation. They don't want to sound too political because they're afraid of that. And I sympathize with pastors that are afraid to preach an authentic gospel, even though it might offend the so-called conservatives in their congregation. But when we do that, we're serving a different God than Jesus, because we are afraid of the truth of the gospel and think that if we dumb it down, if we don't talk about its explicit implications, then we'll lose people. But I believe that we will gain people and create safety for the oppressed when we do that, that we cannot just try to appear nonpartisan. I received a lot of criticism for writing things and for sharing perspectives that appeared to be overtly political. Do you have to make this political? You have to bring politics into this. You have to bring politics up. But politics are a matter of my life. They're a matter of the lives of the oppressed. It isn't a matter for us we can't not bring up politics when we are a body in a room and our body has political meaning. My skin color has political meaning. I can't help but be political just in my own existence. And if I want to be authentic to myself, if you want to be real, if you want to be genuine, if you want to be your full self as a person of color, then allowing political vanity to inform our existence dehumanizes us and defeats that purpose, that end.
I'm sure you experience this too, where you're preaching about God's justice and how we work that out in our lives, and people say, did you have to be, such a Democrat, or did you have to, be so political? It's like, I say, since when is God political? This is about who God is. God is a God of justice, and if that sounds political to some people, fine, but
right.
Certainly has political ramifications and overlap in the political arena, but it's more than just politics. It's God. Could you react to that?
Yeah, God's justice and God's call for compassion and peace and justice in the world may only incidentally approach our politics in a very practical way. But if we're to follow God in what it means to be truly just, we will greatly exceed the constraints of our political economy quickly. And we will come up with ideas and practices that extend beyond our political framework. It would be disappointing if all we did was operate within the current political confines. But we have a prophetic imagination because we are blessed, because we know that the battle, though it's ongoing, the war is ultimately won, and that Jesus will come and liberate the oppressed and liberate all of us. And so because we have this transcendent hope, we can work today on imminent change. Now, some of that will be in the ballot box and some of that will be in our political parties, fine. But when we imagine a world without violence, we can now imagine a world without war, and a world without even police, a world without environmental degradation, a world without oppression. These are the kind of things that we're fortunate to imagine. And then some people will call us impractical. They'll say that doesn't work. But we can hold the practical, and we can take the steps that we can to make political change occur, while also holding on to this radical idea that Jesus gives us, that God gives us, of this totally new way of doing things. And so we don't have to be constrained by our political system. We can follow the God of peace and the God of justice into brand new territory.
I'm going to play the devil's advocate just for a moment here, if you'll pardon me. So you're advocating some involvement in partisan politics, and yet isn't partisan politics the reason that the church, especially the white evangelical church, has lost its witness in our society, being wedded to one particular political party?
Yeah, I really appreciate you mentioning this, because this is the number one thing that people say. You tell us that Jesus takes a side when the religious right, the moral majority, and now we have Christian fascists and Christian nationalists taking a side very clearly. Are you suggesting that what they're doing is right because they're taking a political side? I think this is what gets us into trouble, actually, because people will see the intense sidedness of the right wing, and they'll see the sordid results of it, and then decide, I can't get involved in politics because I would be just as bad as them. But here's the thing. It isn't just a matter that you make any political stance that you want to make. My argument isn't that any political side is one you should take, or it doesn't rest at taking a political side. My argument is about whose side to take, not whether you should take a side or not. And so, are you taking the side of the powerful? Are you taking the side of the wealthy, of the violent, of the government who purveys violence on us? Or are you taking the side of the oppressed, the victim, the orphan, the widow, the lowly, the afflicted? These are the questions we must answer. And so, if your politics, if you have a political framework and it causes you to side with people whose politics results in death, then you might be taking the wrong side. If your politics results in LGBT suicide, if it results in black people being killed by police, if it results in immigrants being put in cages and getting sick, if it results in death, then it is the wrong side to take. If your politics results in life, it's the right side to take. And so, for me, that is basically how it works out. There is a side in this country right now that is leading us towards fascism, leading us towards ending our democracy and ending our even freedom in many ways. And then there's a side that wants to help us freely express ourselves and be who we are. There's a side that wants to liberate the poor and fill them with good things. And so for me, taking a side politically isn't enough. We have to take the side that Jesus would take. And once again, my argument is we should take the side of the oppressed. This text in particular is for people who this isn't really meant to convert somebody who is very conservative or a Donald Trump supporter or an insurrectionist or whatever. Because if they have those beliefs, then they're already in those beliefs, and I'm not going to try to change their mind. It is for people who are offended by the manifest evil of the Trump administration and past administrations, but feel constrained to acting politically because they understand that political action of the right and of the Christian right, of the white evangelical right, has resulted in this problem. So I want to encourage people who feel shy about acting politically against what their conscience tells them is wrong, which is, Christian nationalism, among many other things, and give them permission to say, no, you can take a different side too, and you can act politically too. They don't have to have a monopoly on political action. You can do something different.
Like a lot of pastors, I think, looking at the past two elections, the first election in which Trump was elected, I was shocked and horrified. It made me actually physically ill, and I thought, this can't be. They can't understand what they're doing. That they have to realize that they've made a mistake sooner or later. And then the second election came along, and it seems like they doubled down. His supporters doubled down, Christian supporters doubled down, and the same people voted for him the first election, voted for him
totally.
in the second election.
Even more people did.
Yeah, it was an eye-opening experience, for a lot of us, in realizing, okay, this is something deeply rooted in the history of Christianity in this country. What is it you think that so attracts Christians to that sort of, you said it's on the road to fascism, and also it makes it so offensive to talk about issues of social justice and God's justice?
Well, I mean, this is a subject for a whole other interview, but I want to say that in the United States, Christians got tied up with a lot of different political operations. And if we look at the history of it, we see, and we have to acknowledge this, that there was a lot of Christians in the South supporting slavery. There was a lot of Christians who felt like they had a mandate, biblically, to have slaves and to be expansionists. And so the country exploited this Christian idea and benefited itself through it. And so Christians have been trying to hold on to their power for a long time. And I believe that for white Christians in particular, they are afraid that their country is going to change and become totally different. And they are worried that they will lose their place. They are worried that they will be forced to change their beliefs and their understanding. And so they make a deal with, I mean, this sounds a little dramatic, but they make a deal with the devil to try to keep their power. But Christians aren't intended, we're not trying to keep our power. We're not trying to keep our influence. We are trying to use what power we have to benefit the least of these. To me, if we're more concerned about the right to hold our beliefs than we are for the right of the liberty and dignity of others, we're in bad water. But I want to say, too, that white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, and other forces of death and evil are genuine. They are genuine demons that infest our churches. And so, if I were the devil, I would love to derail the liberating gospel of Jesus with these afflictions, with these disorders, with these conditions that oppress us. And so I am afraid that Christians have chosen to side with groups of people that seemingly would preserve their power, but sadly turn them into something else. As Jesus would say, they turn them into twice the sons of hell that they are.
How do we, as Christians, it's so overwhelming, to think that, well, less than half, I guess, of people would support Donald Trump, and people who call themselves Christians. It just boggles the mind, and it how do you, as a Christian, start to try to make a difference? What would you say in the face of all this would be some first steps that?
Well, the
Christians
first thing to do, yeah, this is really good. The first thing to do is to register to vote wherever you are. Now, in my book, I write about the option of not voting, and I write about the reluctance that I had in voting at all if Bloomberg and Trump were the candidates. And I write about my reluctance to vote for Joe Biden, too, who was accused of sexual assault, similar to how Brett Kavanaugh was and how the Democrats did not investigate it whatsoever. So there is hypocrisy that we will have to overcome to try to take the lesser of two evils, as people commonly say. Sometimes the lesser of two evils will not be lesser enough for us to vote at all. But in this particular election, in the midterm election, I would tell people, register to vote where you are and support the candidate that you think elevates the oppressed. That's a very practical thing to do. But other than that, I would continue to write your legislators, right, your senators and your congresspeople about issues that you care about. And talk to people. You don't have to be an expert at everything. Talk to people who have interests and know what they're talking about various issues, and see what their perspective is. And then write your senators and your legislators to make that change happen. I think it's important that we continue to advocate for voting rights, that everybody has a chance to make their voice known. Because in this country, there's still a lot of disenfranchisement. So those are some basic things to do. And then for me, I found a particular local issue that I'm passionate about. That's housing activism. I want to help make Philadelphia an affordable place for everybody. And so I'm involved in the Philadelphia Coalition for Affordable Communities. So it's a coalition that does its own actions, and I just lend my voice and my body to their work to try to make it happen. That is specifically where I put most of my political activism time, and I don't get overwhelmed with all the issues. Because you could look at an issue like climate change and think, there's nothing I can do to stop it. You could look at the growing prospect of nuclear war that Russia is perpetuating and think, I'm helpless in this. But find something practical you can do to advance this fight that we're in to elevate the oppressed.
Well, maybe could you talk to us about how did you get involved with with housing activism? What were the steps that you took to get involved in that particular issue in your local context?
So we have a congregation planted here over 15 years ago in this neighborhood, when this neighborhood was a little bit more inexpensive, lower income. And as we planted there, new residents moved in, sometimes because of our church, but oftentimes because of other things, and housing prices went up, and the neighborhood was gentrifying. And so to do our part in undoing that, we joined this coalition to try to advocate for affordable housing. And we've been part of that coalition for nearly 2 decades. And I thought it was the right thing to do. As our church in this neighborhood could have been contributing to harm, we wanted to contribute to good and change how things were happening.
The current political situation, do you have, and I ask this of all of our guests, so pardon me, do you have hope? Do you have hope for this nation, this country, that we're going to weather this storm, this attack upon our democracy, voting rights, and all that?
Well, I'll quote the psalmist when I say I don't put my hope in chariots or horses. I remember witnessing. I remember I was watching on January 6th the confirmation of the electoral votes, and I knew there was some protest happening, and I didn't think much of it. But I remember that moment when the Capitol was insurrected, when there was a siege on the Capitol. I mean, that was such a mind-boggling moment. And I'm an Anabaptist, and so I've always said Jesus is Lord, and I don't put my faith in political actions. But when I saw the possibility that major aspects of our democracy could be destroyed and were undermined, I wondered what that would do for the least of these among us. And so, though I don't put my trust in our political systems, it is important for us to preserve the systems that help the oppressed the most. So I agree with your concern, your appropriately grave concern about what is happening. And I pray that this can change. Do I have hope? I am gaining some hope because I believe that with enough political nerve and will, we can make the changes that we need to make. The fascism is growing, hatred is growing, but I think because we are marching against the marching against oppression, and the demons of white supremacy are getting anxious and are doing their best to try to fight back. And I think that's what we see in our country right now. When we elected our first black president, and he was very problematic, especially with the drone warfare and the bombing of Yemen and Somalia and so on, we elected a white supremacist in the next election. And so you can see the white lash, the resistance. And so I think that the louder the opposition is to the side that's with the oppressed, the better we're doing. And I think that with enough leadership and with enough nerve and with enough power among the people who want to liberate the oppressed, that we do have hope. And I believe that we will have a freer society. And that benefits everybody, including Christians in it. Christians don't need to be afraid that their way of life will be destroyed. If their way of life is rooted in bigotry and hatred, maybe they will be. But if we are following Jesus to liberate and dignify people, I don't think we have anything to be worried about.
When my family and I moved down here moved from the Northeast to here to the South, we thought, well, there's so many churches where, there's one on every corner down here in the Bible Belt. We'll certainly be able to find one that we can at least stand. So we attended one church, and I don't know, it was sort of a charismatic church, and we were listening to wonderful worship. I felt the Holy Spirit's presence. It was we felt like we were home. And then, unfortunately, the pastor got up and started talking about how he believes that Donald Trump is the God's anointed. So we said, well, clearly this is not the church for us. And I was deeply offended, not just at the pastor, but I was offended at God. It's like, why do you show up, when these people are saying these things? And I'm sure that, God has a perfect explanation for that. I know he doesn't make mistakes. But then we tried to go to a little bit more of a Bible church, straight evangelical church, and there the pastor stood up and said, can't we all just get along? We need to be united. We need to just accept each other. It's kind of like what you were talking about at the beginning.
Yeah.
Without any acknowledgement of sin, of the truth, how do you be reconciled to your brother if there's no acknowledgement that there was wrongdoing?
That's exactly right.
And so we said, okay, well, I'm tired of going to church and leaving angry, my blood pressure up. This shouldn't be part of the experience. I know that no church is perfect, but how would you advise, people who are maybe having trouble? Because I've talked to a lot of people who are like-minded with us and having a big problem trying to find a church. And of course, the COVID lockdown sort of made it easy just not to, go to church. But how would you advise someone in that predicament who's really, wants to be part of something but just cannot find anything in their area?
Well, first I'll speak to the pastors, because I think pastors have a lot of influence as a pastor. I will say this. If you think that your church or your communion table or even your community potluck is safe with people who are transgender, people who are black, people who are immigrants, if they're safe communing with people who think they are less than human, who think it's okay for police to brutalize them, and think it's okay to deport them rather, then you're not creating a safe table. And the Apostle Paul warns us about this. When he talks about unity in the body, Paul says to Corinth, who is divided between the weak and the strong, the wealthy and the lower class, the lower status people, he says, if you want unity in your body, if you want your body to suffer from no dissension, then elevate the voices that you've disrespected. Elevate the voices that you've dishonored. Don't do anything special to the voices that you already honored, because they're already fine. Elevate those other voices, and then you will find unity. And so to pastors, elevate the voices of your most vulnerable. And if you don't have room for your most vulnerable because your theology is too racist or sexist or whatever, then interrogate that problem. And for people who are suffering and can't find a place to worship, I would encourage them to create their own communities with people who want to affect change. You know, famously in the Sermon on the Mount, this isn't totally the context of it, but we hear this a lot, where 2 or 3 are gathered, there am I among the midst, is what Jesus is saying. And I think that we can create our own house churches, our own cell groups that help people follow Jesus and make disciples today. If you can't find a church, you can start something on your own, and you might find enough people around you to make it happen. And it can be simple, but it can be edifying, and it can be encouraging. Spending our time trying to change churches may be what we need to do, and so you might want to spend your time doing that. I mean, I think it is very hard to join the community and then want to change it. I'm encouraging pastors to listen to those voices, but at some point you have to stop throwing pearls before swine. Speaking from experience, it is very hard to change a church, to make it an anti-oppressive force in the world. And so I would encourage people to start their own. And don't be ashamed of leaving. You know, God understands you. You know, when Jesus sends out his 72, when he sends out his disciples, he gives them a very strong charge. He says to them, you know, go into towns, minister to these people, you know, give them the honest truth from God. And if they don't listen to you, when you enter a town and they're not welcome, he says, go into the streets and say, even the dust of your town we will wipe from our feet as a warning to you. Yet be sure of this, the kingdom of God has come near, and I tell you, it will be more bearable on that day for Sodom than for that town. Jesus is saying, if they don't want to follow me, then dust your heels. Don't keep doing this. Don't burn yourself out. Don't lose your faith. Find a place that encourages you. Find Christians that encourage you because faith is it's a fragile and delicate thing. It's like a plant that needs to be cared for very carefully. And if we want to change churches, recalcitrant churches on our own, we'll be up for a battle that might diminish our faith and destroy it. I have seen a lot of people frustrated just lose their faith altogether. So I would say create community with those who want to follow Jesus and serve the God of the oppressed.
That's really good advice. I think that's the best answer I've had to that question all along. Jonny Rashid, thank you so much.
So happy to talk.
Making time with us. We've been talking to Pastor Jonny Rashid, who's the author of a new book, Jesus Takes a Side, Embracing the Political Demands of the Gospel. Tell us about your book. It's available on Amazon and other online booksellers.
Amazon, bookshop.net, directly from Herald Press or Menno Media. It's paperback, Kindle, and also paperback and hardcover too. I'd love to talk to you more about it. So if you want me to be on your podcast or be at your church or whatever, I'd love to do it. So hit me up.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for tuning in. And this is Pastor S.J. Munson signing out.